In his new book, The Big Oyster, History on the Half Shell, Mark Kurlansky chronicles the history of New York City through one of its earliest and perhaps most important natives, the oyster. What a way to view the history of New York City.
It was just a great story, which is always what I look for. They were just everywhere. The East River here was full of oysters. When people thought of New York City, they thought of oysters.
Yeah.
So there used to be oyster stands on every block. For the cost of one hot dog, you could get a dozen oysters.
You mentioned in your book, too, that even back with the Lenape Indians, oysters were pretty much seen as a delicacy, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, they weren't, they're not a practical, efficient food. It's a lot of work for just this little piece of meat that's not even a high-protein piece of meat.
The oyster is probably one of the few things we eat alive, basically.
Yeah, that's right. If an oyster is shucked correctly, its heart is still beating.
The Dutch were all looking for that pearl in the oyster.
Pearls don't come from oysters. They come from this thing that we call an oyster pearl. It's something that's actually more closely related to a mussel.
Back in the early 1800s, you mentioned that there was about $6 million worth of oysters sold a year. That's a lot of oysters.
It's a lot of oysters when you consider that they were selling all you could eat for 6 cents. Oysters in New York City is one of the few examples I've ever found of a food that crosses all socioeconomic lines. You could go to an oyster stand or one of these really sleazy oyster cellars, which they had a lot of in slums. And then you could go to a restaurant like Delmonico's that evening for a banquet, and you would have the exact same oyster served in the exact same way. You look at the history of the city, you suddenly understand who we are and how we got this way.
Mark, I'll never ever look at an oyster the same way again, and you've made my day with this book.
Well, thanks
a lot.
Great talking to you.
I really appreciate it.